I'll just lubricate the film advance shaft here, and I'm using graphite grease to do this. I'll pull back that spring, get some on the shaft above the bush and below it, and work it backwards and forwards. That'll probably work that grease into the bush. It has done. That's very good. I'll rub some into the spring, and that will do the job. So I'll put that bush into the base of the take-up spool, open the back of the camera, drop that into place. Fit the film advance shaft through there. And drop this into place. With 3 screws in there, go into the base. By convention, that split in the bush points towards the ends of the camera, but it doesn't make an awful lot of difference. The convention probably meant that when the camera was assembled, there was a generally the right spring tension was easy to achieve. Of course, older cameras, the springs have suffered any amount of stress, varied amounts of stress, and because of the state of the mechanism, you may want more spring tension in some than others. So the original alignment is a bit moot. Right, I'll put the sprocket shaft in place. So I'll lubricate this with a little bit of synthetic grease on the shaft, top and bottom, where it passes through the casting, and typically a little wipe onto the gear at the top, the pinion. The sprocket goes in slot side upwards. Drop that shaft down in place. It should pass right through the body without too much grief. Just reach in with my tweezers and centre it up. There we go, that's good. Close the front of the camera so it's easier to get this to sit flat on the bench. Why does it not want to fold? Oh, okay. I haven't put the guide bush on the front shaft yet. Let's do that. Save fighting with this camera anymore. Where's the bush? There's the bush. And the front gear that couples to the transfer shaft, I'll put a smear of grease on there, make sure that couples to the shaft correctly. It's not quite doing it for me. Let's collapse that front slightly so I can see that shaft. Here it is. Should have done this before I put the door on the front. It's much easier. That's better, it's in place. So, the front cover. goes here. And the 2 chrome screws. Let's get this one in place because I can see it. Just that running very loosely. I'm holding down the shutter release with my finger here so I can see the hole for the other screw, and hopefully I can get that screw in. Tighten that up slightly so this stays where I've left it. See if I can place that screw in the hole. Nope, just lift it out. Could really do with one of those screw holding screwdrivers. And don't tell me about magnetised screwdrivers because this is a brass screw. That's in place. Tighten that screw up. Tighten its mate up. And now I can fold the front of the camera as I was trying to do just before. You can open the back. We need to put the screw into our sprocket shaft at the top here, the screw that drives the sprocket, and it drops in right there. Do that up. At the base of the camera we have our lever, our lock lever that latches the rewind button up into the working position when you press the button in. Put a smear of molybdenum paste on that leading edge and some through the pivot for good measure, since I've got that sitting there. Want the return spring for that, which is here, and the shoulder screw that runs around. The screw has 2 shoulders, one that the lever revolves around and one that the spring revolves around. See if I can get that started. Here it is. And tighten that screw up. Just open the front of that camera again so everything stay where I put them. Now lift that spring across like that. Now, holding my finger on the top of the shaft here, if I swing that lever out of the way, I can pop that shaft up out into place, and I can fit the rewind button. The rewind button there, and I want its spring, which I have cleverly hidden somewhere. Did I knock that off the tabletop here? I've done it. There it is. You can see all along. You can stop looking. So, bit of grease through the spring. I'm using synthetic grease there. Put the button on the spring. Put the washer on the button, hold my finger on the top of the shaft, screw this loosely into place, check that the button will move, that it passes the washer and passes the lever. It looks like it does. I can do that button up. Don't overdo that, that button is only brass and it's easily broken. Alright, well that part's good. Now that spring, as that's jumped, has it? Let's get that back where it belongs. That's better. The tripod socket. I've already checked that. I know that the screw threads for the tripod sockets around are good. I've shortened those two screws. I went hunting for my Dremel. I don't know where I've put it. So I had to use a file, like an animal. Get those three screws in place, tighten them up. A little shield for the rewind button can go in place. Right, the leather. I want to glue that leather back down now before anything else happens to it. I will use a piece of paper and transfer the glue from the paper to the leather, because the leather's a little bit delaminated looking under there, and I want to poke the adhesive exactly where I want it. Now that delamination effect there is strictly down to the scalpel and the way it was slicing into the leather, because the leather was exceptionally well glued down to the surface of the body, and the scalpel wouldn't slide down into that glue layer. The glue was too sound, I suppose you'd say. It was in too good a state. Often the glue is dried out and fragments up, and the scalpel will slide underneath it quite easily, or through the glue layer. This was not the case. That'll do us. Let's get that leather down. Well, the leather's fine. That transfer has not survived well at all. However, I'm not going to remove the remains because I wouldn't be thanked for that. Just have to leave that as is. Just removing a bit of excess adhesive that had squeezed out there. And there. Get that leather sitting down flush. That looks good. And I can put the surround in there that wasn't there previously, because now we've got one. Well, I'm not sure I was recording earlier. Here was the tripod surround that I had selected and I'd fitted to the camera, and I noticed it didn't pull down flush against the leather. It was floating slightly high. It was riding on the centre of that bush. So I went hunting to see if I could find another, and I've got one here that is clearly recessed in the base, and I suspect that will be a better fit. And certainly that's the case. It does fit much better. So that was a trap for young players. I'm not sure when they made that change, but clearly they did. So I'll clean this and I'll fit this one. This one's not quite as pretty, but even a less pretty part is better than no part at all. Let's get that on there and fit the screws. Yes, that's much better. It's pulled down snug there against the base of the camera, and that's what we should have had. This spare part here, this part, has got no recess, and so it was just floating on that base. This transfer on the base of the camera, that's just coming away completely. It really couldn't stand any flex at all. Yeah, it's just lifted right off the leather there. Oh, I might speak to the owner, see if he wants me to remove it completely. It's had it. It's not serving any useful purpose anymore. But we can carry on. The base of the camera is closed up. Front of the camera is dealt with. The top of the camera, that's next. I need to get this film advance assembled. Right, film advance components. Let's get some. Not getting much traction here today. Let's get something done. I'll start with the clutch. The clutch is important because the clutch allows some controlled slippage between the take-up spool and the sprocket. If you didn't have controlled slippage, you would end up ripping out the film sprocket holes. Then you end up with the back of your camera filled up with those little film chips, waiting to fall into places and jam things up. So I'm just going to compress this clutch spring, holding that firmly in those crimp lug pliers. I've put some graphite grease on the inside of the outer component. I can slide that over there, and I've got nice smooth controlled slippage there. Exactly what I want. Quick wipe of synthetic grease on the inside and a touch on the gear for good measure. Drop that in the top of the camera. The bush for the film advance shaft, the top bush, I just put a wipe of synthetic grease on the inside, and these parts have been through the ultrasonic cleaner. They're pretty much free from any lubricant they once had, so I've got to force some grease into these two little gear sets. I do that by putting a blob on there and applying some pressure with my thumb, and then basically hydraulic pressure just pushes the grease into where you want it to go to. Of course it doesn't need much, just a tiny smear and there's going to be plenty if you can get it in. So I'm just rolling the sprocket shaft and the take-up spool with my thumb there to engage the gear sets, and there are 3 screws that hold their guide bush down in place. Just checking they're moving freely, they are. Now these 2 little gears you see at the top here, one of them is coupled to the sprocket shaft, you can see that revolving, and one of them is coupled to the take-up spool. And of course once I put the drive gear on the top there, those 2 pieces are coupled. So that's the next thing to do. Wipe a bit of grease on there, drop that in place. Now you'll see those rotate together. This is the drive dog that connects everything up, and the spring sits on top of that. This conical coil spring here, small end up. That rides in this piece, and I'm just going to apply a bit of grease to this around the ratchet pawl, the ratchet areas here where the pawl runs, and put this in place. Now I happen to know that probably about there is a good place to start that, and it'll give me good rewind, good tension to spin the advance lever back to the rest position. That looks good. Now, the pawl that drops in for the action on that advanced pawl on this disc here, and forms the ratchet action that allows you to only move the film advance forward until the stroke's completed, and once the stroke's completed, pops back up to the other position and runs on the other ratchet position, and only allows you to return the film advance lever to the rest position. So you can't inch the film advance on one of these cameras. You may be used to doing that if you've been used to Japanese SLRs of later eras. You could inch the film advance. You can't do that here. The action has to be completed. if you do attempt to inch the action of the film advance, you're going to come unstuck. Basically the lever will not want to return to the start position, and you'll end up breaking something if you force it. Now I'm just putting the spring and its shoulder screw in this position to make sure the spring revolves freely around that screw and isn't trapped underneath it. That looks good. And the most awkward screw to get in place is this one at the back here. Trying to get that to drop down into position is always entertaining. It made a liar of me that time because it did move without too much of a fight. Okay, let's get these 3 screws tightened now. Good. Now this spring here needs to go behind this lever, so I'm going to hold that lever down, lift the spring over the back of it and drop it back in place. That's all good. The gear goes on top of the film advance shaft there and meshes with this gear in the plate. There's a space that goes on top of that. Now this, we'll call that the rest position. That looks just right. I'm going to revolve that one full turn. That's the start position now. I've got that tensioned. If I put the film advance lever on there, which is here, and press that down, turn part of the way around, so I'm about 1/4 of a turn in. I have the shutter cocking rack here. I'm just going to lubricate that. Now you may have heard old wives' tales about the shutter cocking rack on a Retina IIa being a fragile thing and it'll break. Don't get a Retina IIa, get a Retina II. That's a load of crap. There's nothing wrong with the cocking racks on the Retina IIas. They're very robust. Just checking to see I've got that in the correct position there. I'll try it one more tooth further in. Yeah, that looks better. Okay. So I can take that off. The advance is about 90 degrees. I've turned that around about 90 degrees in the forward direction. That's a handy place to park it. I'm going to do my film rewind now. So the inside shaft, this inside piece here, I'm lubricating that with synthetic grease. It's got a small protrusion on the bottom, on the front edge there, which lines up with a slot in here. So the two are driven together. It cannot rotate inside there. I'll lubricate the bush. And fit the shaft in there. To get the bush over the shaft, sometimes it's useful to use your screwdriver tip to just pull that spring back slightly. Yeah, that's something at the door. Probably incoming cameras back shortly.